So today we're going to be looking at plants. We're actually going to look at two different sections of plants. We're going to look at plant organ systems, and then we're also going to look at plant tissues. So this is just a really brief overview. We spend less time on plants than we do on animal cells, but it can be a great comparison. So you're going to find that even though plants have different organ systems and different tissues, they're really meant to serve the same function that we do in humans. So let's start with a couple different plant systems. These can be likened to our plant organ systems. You really only have two in the plants that we're going to talk about in this unit. You have the shoot system and you have what's called the root system. So the root system you can see is underground. The shoot system is up here. The shoot system actually has three different components to it we're going to talk about. It's got the leaf, it's got the stem, and it's got the flower. So you might not have considered these as different sections of the plant before, but each one of them has a very unique job that it does for the plant, and each of these jobs can be likened to a job of an organ system in humans as well too. So let's start by talking about the shoot system. The shoot system has two main functions. So it's going to conduct photosynthesis and produce flowers. So photosynthesis is what's going to get the plant its energy. It's like the cellular respiration for plants. Plants also go through cellular respiration for energy as well. And then the flower is going to be the sexual reproduction. So it's how plants actually reproduce to form other plants. Let's look at the first part, which is the leaf. I'll move myself up here. So the leaf is the main photosynthetic structure of the plant. So just a reminder of what photosynthesis looks like. You've got carbon dioxide coming in along with water. Here you also have energy from the sun as well too. So photosynthesis actually uses energy. And then what we're producing here is glucose and oxygen. So photosynthesis itself doesn't give the plant energy. What it does is it allows the plants to produce glucose, which is sugar, and oxygen. So essentially, photosynthesis allows the plant to produce its own food. The plant can then use this sugar in cellular respiration to get its own energy. We often eat plants as well too for that glucose to get our own energy. Remember that plants are actually the bottom of the food chain from grade 9. So plants are the way that we can actually harvest energy from the sun into edible energy. So all energy in the food chain actually does come from plants, whether you're eating a plant or whether you're eating an animal that has eaten a plant. So let's take a closer look at the leaf and how it does it. So this is a cross section of a leaf. You're going to have a diagram of this later that you're going to go ahead and you're going to label. Chloroplasts in the leaf have chlorophyll. So you can actually see the chloroplasts are going to be in the leaf. You can't see them in this picture. And they have chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a green pigment. So chlorophyll is a green pigment that absorbs light energy, and it allows that light energy to be used in photosynthesis. So chlorophyll is actually why leaves are green. I posted a pretty cool video here as well too. I figured it's kind of like timely with fall. You don't have to watch it, but it's a pretty neat chemical reaction about why leaves change colors in the fall. It's actually a chemical reaction, but it is related to chlorophyll. So take a look if you're interested. Glucose is then made and it's used for plant growth and energy storage. So photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast. We can harvest the sun energy using chlorophyll. And then during photosynthesis, we produce sugar, and that sugar can be used for plant growth or for energy storage. Leaves are always thin. This is to get as much sun as possible. So the thinner the leaf, the higher the surface area is. The higher the surface area, the more part of it is being hit by the sun. So if leaves were like little balls, the center of the leaf would never see any sun. So leaves are always flat to try to get as much sun as possible. Underneath the leaf, you have, we call them stoma, and what they do is they're openings that let carbon dioxide get out, in and oxygen out. So you can actually see a stoma here. It's a small opening, and that's actually going to allow the carbon dioxide required for photosynthesis to come in, and it's going to allow the oxygen that's being produced by the plant to come out. So this is actually just a picture of what a stoma looks like. Stoma can be open or closed depending on how much photosynthesis is happening. So we can see an open stoma here. We can see a closed stoma here. And around the outside here, we have what's called guard cells. And those guard cells can squeeze shut and that closes the stoma, or they can be open and that opens the stoma. So next off, that was the leaf. We're going to talk about the flower. And what the flower does is the flower is used for sexual reproduction. Sure, you never really thought of that before. Flowers just look really pretty, but they're really important for the plant to be able to reproduce. Interesting about flowers is that they actually contain both the male and female reproductive structures, and sometimes both at the same time. So the flower doesn't really look different between a male flower and a female flower, and sometimes both flower can contain both male and female reproductive structures. So what the male reproductive structure looks like is they are here. They're called stamen. So this is a lily. You can actually really see the stamen in the lily. But all plants do have some sort of male reproductive structure, and they produce pollen grains. Pollen grains are like the sperm of plants. So pollen actually acts as the male reproductive gamete in plants. The female part of the flower is actually eggs. So it's the same as in females. So you actually have ovules, and that's often lower down in the flower. So if you take grade 11 biology, you'll actually do a flower dissection where you take a lily, you take a cross section, and you can often see ovules or eggs in the bottom of the flower. If you have a really big, beautiful flower at home, keep it, enjoy it. But if it's dying, go ahead, take a cross section of it, and you can actually see the ovules in the bottom of the plant there. And here you can see actually the stamen as well too at the top. So what happens is the eggs are going to get fertilized by the pollen. Preferably, we like to see the eggs from one plant get fertilized from the pollen from another plant. This is called sexual reproduction. You're going to learn more about it in grade 11, but sexual reproduction produces more variety. If you have asexual reproduction, you're constantly reproducing with yourself, you can tend to amplify defects. That's why in humans, you also don't want to breed relatives that are too close together because they can amplify birth defects. We'll talk about this more in grade 11. So essentially the flowers want to mate with another flower, not with itself. So what actually happens is after pollination, the female flower is going to form seeds. So once the eggs have actually been pollinated, we're going to see seeds. So seeds are kind of like plant babies. That's like the fertilized egg of plants is seeds. So you can think of pumpkin seeds, tomato seeds. We've got a papaya here, pomegranate. In most flowering plants, seeds are contained within fruit. So most flowering plants will produce a fruit. That's again kind of the offspring. And the seeds within it, that's the actual fertilized egg. So when you want to have a new plant, you plant a seed, you water it, and it's like planting a baby plant, and it's going to eventually grow into an adult plant. Pollination happens in lots of different ways. Grasses are often wind pollinated, as are trees. So trees, you can see sometimes keys, acorns, those are all examples of things being spread around. Grasses, sometimes you've seen these tall grasses with this pollen in it. So the wind will actually come by and blow that pollen and hopefully come in contact with the egg from another plant. Pollinators are very important as well too. So you might have heard of the whole save the bees. Bees are actually very important, especially in the Niagara area. We see a lot of fruit and our wine industry. So we are very reliant on bees in this area. So insects, birds, bats, and most importantly bees are used to pollinate it. So oftentimes the reason that flowers are such bright and beautiful colors and the reason that they smell so sweet is actually to attract pollinators. So those plants that are likely to attract pollinators are more likely to have more offspring, which is really what plants want. They want to have lots of babies. So by attracting pollinators, you get more bees trying to drink your nectar, and you can see this bee actually has pollen stuck to it. So what's going to happen is this bee is then going to go to another plant. It's going to rub that pollen on the other plant, and it's going to allow that plant to become fertilized. Next, let's move on to the stem. So just to recap, the leaf helped with cellular respiration and photosynthesis, and the Flower helped with sexual reproduction. Now we're going to look at the stem. Stem can also be a trunk if you're talking about a tree or a bigger plant. It helps to support branches, leaves, and flowers, so it supports those other structures we talked about. More importantly, though, it also provides the transport of material, and it actually grows against gravity. So we're going to talk in a second about the root system, and the root system is going to help us to absorb stuff. The stem is actually what carries this stuff. So we have a cross section here. Oftentimes in the middle of a stem or trunk, you can see a pith. So if you've ever seen a tree stump, you can see almost the tree rings. That's a pith growing bigger every year. You also see these things called a xylem and a phloem though. Those are little tubes that actually help to carry stuff against gravity up to the leaf and up to the flower. So they help to carry nutrients and water up to the leaf and up to the flower. They almost are like veins. So think about veins in your body carrying stuff around. These are like the veins of the plant. So they contain a large amount of, we call this vascular tissue to transport material. Again, we have the xylem. The xylem is very specific, where the xylem only transports water and minerals to the plant, whereas we call this the phloem. The phloem transports food or sugar. So I always remember phloem transports food and xylem transports water. X and W are close to each other in the alphabet. Now let's talk about the root system. So the shoot system was the flower, the leaf, and the stem. Now we're going to talk about the root system, which has two functions. First function is it anchors a plant into the ground. Second function is it helps to absorb water and minerals from the soil. Roots always grow with gravity, whereas the stem grows away from gravity. You can have two different types of root systems. So if you've ever weeded your garden before, I'm sure you've seen both. First one is that one that's really satisfying to pull. It's called a taproot, and taproots go really deep into the ground. So if you've ever pulled something out and it's got a really long root, that's a taproot. It's one main root with smaller roots coming off of it, and it grows incredibly deep to get more water and nutrients. So plants are actually in competition with each other. If you have two plants that are planted side by side, they're fighting over nutrients. So the whole goal for a taproot is to get deeper than its neighbors to try to get more nutrients. The other one, these are the pain in the butt when you're trying to garden. These are our fibrous roots, and they are all exactly the same size, and they actually spread out. So grass is a really great example of this. So if you've ever tried to pull out a big clump of grass, it's really hard because you have lots of small roots spread out below the surface. They're spreading laterally. So it's really just two different strategies to get more nutrients. Taproot is going to go deep, whereas the fibrous root is going to branch out and have lots of little branches trying to gather as much water and nutrients as possible. Most roots are actually white in color, so when you pull them out, you very seldom see green. This is because they don't have any chlorophyll. Let's think about what the function of chlorophyll is. Chlorophyll is to capture sunlight for photosynthesis. There is no sunlight underground. Therefore, we're not going to have any chlorophyll. There's no point. So what makes plants green is chlorophyll. Since there's no sunlight underground, there's no point having chlorophyll underground, and those leaves are going to appear white. Some roots actually store food for the plant. These are often, we call them tubers. So those are the plants that we actually eat that grow underground. So carrots, radishes, beets, potatoes, those are all actually essentially the root of the plant. That's because those roots are acting as storage. They store all the sugar. That makes them taste really good for us. And we want to use that sugar for our own food source. So we're going to eat those roots. So those were our kind of organ systems. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about the different plant tissues and what they do for the body. So we have 4 tissue systems in plants. Again, if I can remind you, we have 4 tissue systems in humans, so very similar. The tissue systems are meristematic, dermal, vascular, and ground tissue. So we're going to talk about what each of these tissues can do for the plant. Let's talk about meristematic. They are on-specialized, and they can divide and differentiate into specialized cells. So if we were going to liken this to a human's tissue or a human cell, we would say these are like the stem cells. So these are the on-specialized parts of the plant that can grow and differentiate into whatever area the plant might need. Dermal tissue is the outermost layer of the plant. So we actually have here, you can see the words upper epidermis and lower epidermis. If you look, this looks very similar to the skin or epithelial tissue that I showed you before. That's because it's very much the same thing. Epithelial tissue and dermal tissue act to actually cover and protect the plant. It can be specialized. Epidermal root cells can form root hairs to absorb water and minerals, so they're going to look different in the root, whereas epidermal leaf cells produce a waxy, waterproof cuticle. This is protect the leaf and to keep water in because you want to use water for photosynthesis. So oftentimes you might have seen a waxy covering on a leaf. This is the dermal tissue acting to protect the leaf and to keep water in. The vascular tissue is the xylem, which again transports water, and that phloem, which transports sugar. So this is what's in the stem of the plant. So this is again almost like the plant's circulatory system. So vascular tissue helps to make up the veins of the plant, the xylem and the phloem to transport nutrients. And the last one here that we have is ground tissue. The ground tissue is located between the dermal and the vascular tissue, and it's kind of like the jack of all trades. It can do photosynthesis, it helps with food and water storage, and it gives structural support. So it does essentially all the other jobs in the plant. So if we are going to take our tissue systems, and if we were going to go ahead and summarize this, these are all different layers that you can see in the plant. And I'm going to show these on a diagram in a second. So let's take a look at our dermal tissue first. We have our upper epidermis, which is dermal tissue. It protects the cuticle, the top of the plant. It minimizes evaporation. We also have something called a lower dermis. That's from the dermal tissue as well too. That contains that stoma that I talked about. And we also have those guard cells that open up the stoma and let in CO2. So again, we have 3 different types of dermal tissues, 1 on the top, 2 on the bottom, that act to line the leaf and protect it in different ways. Our vascular tissue is right in the middle. The tissue is a vascular bundle, and that's made up of the xylem and phloem that transport food and water. And then we have our ground tissue. That ground tissue, again, is between the dermal tissue and the vascular tissue. At the top, we have something called the palisade layer. That's where that photosynthesis happens. So chlorophyll are tightly packed. This is going to increase surface area to absorb sunlight. So you pack a bunch of chlorophyll in. That way you have as many as possible in contact with the sunlight. And at the bottom, we have what's called the spongy mesophyll. These are loosely packed chloroplasts. The reason they're loosely packed is to allow CO2 to flow between them, because again, CO2 is required for photosynthesis. So let's take a look at what this looks like in terms of a picture. Here we have that upper epidermis protecting and keeping water in. You can see that waxy layer on the top. Our other dermal tissue at the bottom here are our stoma. That's actually allowing CO2 in. And our guard cells are on the outside. That's protecting the stoma. In the exact center here, we can see that vascular bundle. That vascular bundle is that xylem and phloem, so transporting nutrients and water. And then we've got our 2 ground tissues, our palisade layer. You can see it's very tightly packed, filled with chloroplasts. This is going to allow maximum amounts of photosynthesis. And we've got our spongy mesophyll down here. So also chloroplast, but you can see it's more loosely packed. This allows CO2 to flow to it to allow photosynthesis to happen. So you actually have a copy of this diagram. Please make sure that you include it in your notes. Please make sure that you label it, because it is important to see where all these structures are. So now that you understand the different organs and the different tissues of plants, I want you to keep them in mind as we go through the different organ systems in humans and think about, really, even though they have a different structure, at the end of the day, they still serve the same function for both the plant and for human bodies.